Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. I'm going to take the A Fork in Time What If machine out for a solo trip. And today we're going to focus on something that is near and dear to me and probably near and dear to many of you as our listeners. And I say that because it's impossible to believe, given an audience of any size, that there would not be an affinity for and a connection to our topic today. But we're going to explore how that topic has weaved its way through history by looking at how things would be if we didn't have it available today. Sitting on my desk in my office is something that a coworker bought me a few years ago. And it simply says, "I drink coffee for your protection." I should say that I do consume a fair amount of coffee. I consume more coffee now probably than I have at any point in my life. A lot of that has to do with time zone shifting, the way my job works, and the various hours that I have to be in contact with folks. And so, me notoriously not being a morning person, my caffeine boost coming in a hot, a liquid form, in this case in the form of coffee. And so today here on our podcast episode, we're going to look at a world, though, where we don't have coffee, where coffee never comes to take the place that it is today, and how would history have been different if we didn't have approximately 2.25 billion cups of coffee. That's the estimated consumption today, every day in the world. So how would history have been different if there had not been the rise and the promulgation of coffee as we know it? That's our topic today here on A Fork in Time. We hope that you join us after the break.
Alexis here, taking a little break from the podcast with
me, it's Don.
And we want to tell you a little bit about the site we actually use to host our podcast, and that would be Buzzsprout. So what are some of the features that you really, really like about Buzzsprout, Dad?
One of the things that I do most of the editing and posting, so I probably interact with it far more than Alexis did. One of the things I like about it, it's easy to use, it's point and click, the interface is really straightforward and clean. So it's easy to know once you've got a file what you do, how you get it uploaded, all the various things that you would do, scheduling, just the mechanics I find pretty simple to use. So I think that's being pretty technically savvy, but I don't think you have to be technically savvy in order to be able to do. Buzzsprout has a lot of wonderful tutorials I've used on that about equipment and how to do things and other things like that. So that's one of the things I like. They make it easy. I think they're relatively inexpensive. You can easily get your podcast started for a low initial investment, and then as it grows, be able to do some additional things with it. And I like it. We've talked about this a number of times because of the stats and the feedback and the other things that they do that allow us to understand not only how many listeners and how many downloads, but where those listeners are. We can get a better understanding about this time that we're spending recording this stuff. Is anybody actually listening to that?
And Buzzsprout says yes.
Buzzsprout makes that easy. So what's the deal that we've managed to get for our listeners if they want to explore the world of creating their own podcast on Buzzsprout?
Yeah, if you follow the link in our show notes, you can get set up on Buzzsprout, and because you follow that link, we get a little bit of support from that, but then we're also supporting you as well, because we don't think of you as competition at all in this we say welcome to the podcast family. So if you are interested in starting your own podcast, but we think Buzzsprout is a great place to start, so follow that link in the show notes, and they will walk you through setting up the process. Like Dad said, it was a super easy setup, tons of tutorials and tons of step-by-step instructions as we got started, because we didn't know really a lot when we got the podcast started, so Buzzsprout was a big help for us.
Good deal. We hope you check it out. Thanks. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. It occurred to me as I was thinking there during the break that some of you might have actually used that as an opportunity to go and top off that cup of coffee that you may have already been enjoying, or to go get you one. Or if you're driving, perhaps to work or other ways that I know oftentimes podcasts are used by commuters. You may be enjoying that cup of coffee now, or that coffee-like particular thing that you have, be it a latte or an espresso, or perhaps it's a caramel macchiato, something that is coffee flavored or coffee related. You may be enjoying that right now as we speak. And if so, we're going to talk about a world, sadly, where that would not be what's in your hand right now as we come back here and pick up the topic. So looking at a world without coffee, there's a couple of different ways that we can look at that. Probably the easiest and simplest, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, is just the actual drink itself. What it would be like to not have the thing that we enjoy and know today as coffee, or that's related to coffee. Well, what other liquid caffeine delivery mechanisms might have risen to the fore, or would we not even be looking for something in the morning, for example, that's a hot caffeinated drink? Although some people I know do prefer their coffee cold or iced. That's a whole other thing. Would we have a different drink that would be there? So we'll explore that very briefly, but that's not the main thing that I want to explore today. The two big historical what-ifs, I think, do center around primarily economics on the one hand. It's the rise of the coffee industry globally and what that's meant, but also what that meant for colonial and industrializing nations in terms of coffee being a part of what was going on from an agricultural and from an economic standpoint. But then perhaps even more importantly, and it does relate to that, is the influence of coffee as a cultural phenomenon, how that cultural phenomenon, not just on, again, how we wake up in the morning to one of those 2.25 billion cups that I mentioned there in the opening, but on how coffee's existence and the consumption of coffee led to social situations that had an influence on our politics. And I think that's actually where the more interesting historical what if would be. What if there were no coffee, in the sense of what if there were no coffee houses and other types of things related to that did have a tremendous influence on history in ways that were not directly about the coffee, but were definitely related to the coffee. So beginning the first of those explorations, let's talk about the actual what-if world, where if we were substituting something else in lieu of coffee. Coffee, of course, delivers caffeine. It's normally consumed by most folks in its hot form, and it's both a fairly concentrated, powerful amount of caffeine, caffeine serving as a stimulant physiologically to the human body, and as a result having an influence on mental state, alertness, other types of things as well. There are other drinks that certainly contain caffeine. Tea is generally caffeinated. There are other sources of caffeine. Cola, for example, a large source of caffeine for many folks in the 20th and 21st century, with the rise of cola drinks as a product. So while coffee is not the unique deliverer of caffeine, it certainly is a powerful and effective way to deliver caffeine. And caffeine, just as a part of diet, is a major influence there. It can have influences on heart rate, as we mentioned before. It can have influences on the alertness of someone, but to the point of also going in the other direction, of making someone overly alert or overly, quote unquote, jittery as a result of the consumption of too much caffeine. And so caffeine has both positive, potentially, and also potentially negative effects. There have been studies over the years that argue back and forth about the health benefits of coffee, what's too little, what's too much. It's certainly known that coffee tends to be a natural laxative. And so when it comes to digestive health, it's one of the things that can enhance the regularity of drinkers of coffee on a regular basis. But it can also influence things like health when it comes to the way that it passes through the body. Again, stimulation of the heart, the nervous system indirectly, the other things that are there. It's a staining influence, so dental health, the other things that are there. So coffee, just as a drink, if it's not present, we would have different issues. Perhaps we would have different things that would be part of our normal dietary culture. The most obvious place to go, because there's the rivalry that arises. We'll talk a little bit about this in the history part of today's episode. Between coffee and tea. Tea, certainly during most of the period of time when Britain, England, later the United Kingdom, is a major influencing factor globally in terms of the creation of its global empire, its colonial empire, and trade associated particularly with England. Tea is a major part of that. Tea coming out of the areas that are controlled and or that are taken from other European powers by the British. And we all know the British to this day still enjoy their cup of tea. Uh, by the time of the American Revolution, because of taxation, of course, we have the Boston Tea Party and other uprisings where coffee becomes, if you will, the patriotic drink in the United States as an expression back against tea. But certainly easy to imagine because I certainly know people that enjoy a hot cup of tea as their preferred breakfast beverage. And so it's easy to imagine that we could have hot tea consumed in the same way that we have hot coffee consumed today. Although that when you think about the way that most people make and consume tea, if they're consuming it as a warm beverage, they tend to do that in a small batch in a cup. It's not the type of thing that we often see that coffee has evolved to in terms of being produced in mass. For example, the coffee machine in the break room that is brewing anywhere from a couple of cups to maybe several dozen cups, or coffee urns at certain situations, for example, on job sites, particularly like industrial job sites or construction job sites, there to get workers up and at it in the morning. Coffee being consumed more or being produced more, even in the way it's consumed on a daily basis in more of quantity, or the ease of it being sort of a portable hot drink that's delivered as a result of that way that it's produced. It's not that you can't get a warm cup of tea that way, but it's just not the way that we do that. So it's difficult for me to imagine tea as a replacement or for coffee in exactly the same way of being that warm, more often than not associated with morning, but not exclusively morning beverage. And one of its major reasons that it's consumed is the delivery of caffeine as a mechanism there. I should just say that also when I talk about hot tea, being from the southern part of the United States, where most of us consume our tea in a cold, sweet variety, I tend to think of tea not so much as a warm drink, although I know that there are people that like their coffee also in an iced or a cold mode as well. And so just that initial thinking of just what drink would be in coffee's place, tea is the obvious thing that comes to mind. Maybe something else would have arisen from that. Maybe we would be drinking hot cola today. It's tough to know what exactly would fill the vacuum that would be left by those 2.25 billion cups of coffee consumed daily. But it's easy to believe that that could be tea, but probably to a lesser degree, just because of the production and consumption of tea as a product. But also just it's hard to imagine what would have taken the place of coffee. So, the first easy explanation of the historical what if is that we might not have something at all that's the equivalent of coffee in terms of what that means, and also what that means just for, again, that general alertness, awakeness. As I mentioned before, I'm one of the people that now falls into this boat. I'm better after I've had my first couple of cups, at least my first cup, probably my first couple of cups of coffee in the morning than I am if I don't. And there's a lot of people I know that would coincide with that. But as I mentioned, I think the more important, broader historical what-ifs to look at actually relate around economics than ultimately around philosophy. And so I'm going to put a number of links in the show notes to things that talk about the history of coffee and the origins of coffee. And there's a number of different stories, some of them apocryphal, some of them more vetted out in fact. But everyone agrees that the source of coffee as we know it is the coffee tree. By the way, the coffee bean is the seed of the fruit that comes from the coffee tree. So technically the coffee tree is a fruit tree, but the particular prize is the seed or the bean that's contained within the coffee fruit. And it was perhaps, depending on which story you believe, noticed by Ethiopian goat herders that when goats ate the fruit from this particular tree and thus were ingesting some of those seeds and thus the coffee bean, that they were a little more active. They were sort of jumpy goats. And so this may have led the first experimentation with taking on that bean, maybe perhaps just sucking on the bean, or crushing the bean or chewing on the bean, other types of things that would have been the delivery of some of the benefits from coffee from that. There's other stories that talk about how we get to the first roasting of coffee, which may have been the disposal of some of that and then noticing the aroma of coffee, because in addition to its taste and the caffeine, there's a lot of people that like the smell of coffee. That's actually an arousing thing for them. That's the sensory perception that's not just taste. But that may have led to the first experimentation with the beans that have been roasted, putting them in water, some of the other things that are there. Again, I'll have links in the show notes and perhaps even links few YouTube videos that I've watched, which sort of tell the fascinating story of the origin of coffee. But the origin of coffee and the spread of coffee is actually one of the more interesting things in history, in the sense that very early on, it was a highly prized commodity that was not grown worldwide. And it's important to know here that while coffee is primarily consumed in industrialized nations that lie outside of the tropics, that 90% of the world's coffee production actually occurs in the tropics because of the growing conditions that are required. And so between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, you have a belt of countries that are capable, and regions that are capable of producing coffee, Ethiopia being one of them. Another particular thing being, for example, Indonesia, the islands there in the Indian Ocean as they're adjacent to the Western Pacific. But then eventually over time we see the expansion of the production areas from coffee coming over to the New World, coming over to the Western Hemisphere, where we find nations like Brazil and Colombia, much of the northern coast of South America on the Caribbean, but also into Central America. Major production today in Guatemala, for example, Costa Rica, other places as well. And then on around further into the heart of the Pacific as Hawaii is a major producer, particularly the island of Kona, for those of you that enjoy Kona coffee. That's coming from Hawaii. All of this is within the tropical belt, tropical climate belt of the world, which is where coffee production takes place. But initially, Ethiopia is the source. It's not a widely available tree or plant. It has to be exported from there before it grows. And that export is actually an interesting story, in the sense that initially there was almost a monopoly on on coffee production. Coffee was almost the secret weapon of the area of Ethiopia and then Yemen. But over time, as Europeans and others became more familiar with it, there was more of a desire to get access to and to grow the product directly. And so it expands out of there into other parts of Africa, eventually finds its way into the area that we think of today as modern Turkey, the Turkish Empire, where this becomes, and there are various ways of producing and consuming the types of things that lead to just new ways of actually enjoying coffee. In many cases adding sugar, so it's not just the caffeine jolt, but it's also the sugar jolt in terms of the impact on the body. And little by little, coffee expands out of this small area of Ethiopia to starting to go into other parts of the world. And in some cases, that's very intentional. We have situations where the Dutch and the Portuguese are very big in terms of expanding and bringing coffee to, for example, I mentioned, to Indonesia. And then eventually, particularly the Portuguese, but also other European powers during the colonial period into North America and Central and South America are bringing the bean over and the plants over to be cultivated. In fact, there's a number of interesting stories about political intrigue, or in one case, a particular person who may have been sent to seduce the wife of a particular leader in one of the smaller, in French Guiana and what we think of today as being Suriname, as how coffee beans or a coffee plant was smuggled out in a bouquet of flowers. And whether that was a legitimate romance or whether that was intentionally to try to get the prize of coffee is, I guess, one of the more interesting things. Probably would make for a great movie. But what you do have here is the economic impact of coffee as being a commodity that becomes both prized, and the ability to produce it becomes a very important thing. And that's not everywhere in the world, and it's not every nation that has possessions where this can happen. And so you actually have the rise of coffee as a major trade, which becomes very important for some of the European powers, but particularly for the Portuguese, for example, and ultimately the settlement of the area that will become Brazil. Brazil today is the largest producer of coffee in the world. More coffee comes from there than any other nation. So the economic growth of coffee leads to the rise and fall of certain empires when it comes to their trade and the economics that was predominant through much of what happened during the colonial period with different commodities, other spices, tea, for example, certainly falls in this same category. Pepper, the other things that actually led to much of the exploration to try to find routes to China, to Asia, and ultimately the overland routes to China were around the exploration. The maritime exploration was around finding routes to get to these sources of various agricultural commodities for the most part, and coffee becomes one of them. as time goes by. That also led to, because of the nature of the cultivation and the production of coffee, that led to economic impacts, particularly in the New World, but also globally with respect to just the economic systems. It is a very labor-intensive exercise to produce and grow and cultivate coffee, particularly in the picking and the harvesting of it, and then the actual work that goes on to make it ready for consumption in terms of what's done to the coffee beans, how they are processed, how they are dried, how in some cases they're roasted, the various things that happen to them. This is a very labor intensive type of economic activity. And like many of the things that were labor intensive economic activities, particularly during the age of colonial expansion into the New World and during the period of time of colonial domination, this led to economies that were heavily based upon the use of slaves and slavery. And so, while there are other crops in the New World, cotton, most predominantly in the United States, for example, that's associated with slavery, in other parts of the Caribbean and other parts of Central and South America, we have sugar plantations, but we also have coffee plantations. That one of the major reasons that you see the import of slaves and the continuation of a slave economy, because of the labor that's required to support this particular thing. And as it grows more and more, as the demand for it grows globally, and so the supply needs to grow, you have more and more of this type of economic condition that is sustained as a result of coffee. So again, imagining the historical what-if world, if there is no coffee, how would that have been different in terms of the development, potentially, of some of these areas that grew during the colonial period to be most noted economically, and that tied to their politics as well, by slavery? Well, it's easy to imagine that there would have been other crops that would have also been, just as I've already mentioned, that would have been just as likely to maintain those things. But for example, sugar, another example again was cotton, but coffee was just another contributor to that. It is interesting to note that Brazil was one of the last nations in South America to actually put an end to the formal practice of slavery. That was in I think 1888 was the date, if I remember correctly. And as a result of that, that was directly the result of the economic impact of coffee cultivation and the need for that, until there were better technologies that came along that changed that, and just the general flow of history looking towards the expansion of freedoms and the end of slavery in general. But the economies of these nations, for example, the economy of Brazil, well tuned to be a source for coffee, and coffee is a little bit more sustainable than some of the ways that is required for the production of sugar, and so it is the type of economy that when you balance those economies together, coffee plus sugar plus some of the other things that are the direct crops, the agricultural impetus behind slavery, it's easy to see that still would have existed, but it might not have persisted for as long, and it might not have been as successful for as long as it was, because coffee had grown to be in tremendous demand around the world, particularly by the 19th century, and that continued to fuel the need for slavery, at least in terms of those who own the resources, thinking that was the only effective way that they could produce the resource in much of Latin America, Central America, and South America. And so there's no doubt that coffee had a tremendous economic influence in terms of how it pervaded from its original 9th century roots in Ethiopia, and it spread across the world over time, and how that interweaved with the history of colonial expansion, seafaring trade, exploration, all the things that go with that. Of course, one of the other major breaks sort of in the economic trend of that actually happens with the American Revolution, where the British colonies that later became the United States are consumers, because they're part of the British Empire. They're consumers of tea, until taxation on that tea causes a little event called the Boston Tea Party and other things, which led to coffee actually taking the place of tea as being the quote-unquote patriotic drink in the United States. John Adams is quoted at one point in saying that. And as a result, coffee becomes much more predominant in the United States as a result of that, with it being antithesis to tea. The proximity of the United States to some of those other areas that I mentioned, Central and South America, also means that now becomes more of a sustaining factor for the continuation of coffee growth, coffee exports, but also coffee plantations in those areas. So in one way you might argue that the persistence of coffee and the rise of coffee in the United States because of tea versus coffee becoming a political issue in the 18th century actually leads to the United States fighting for what it viewed as being its freedoms, but also extending the absence of freedoms for others in the same hemisphere because of what that was doing to the economies that produced uh, that produced that produced coffee, with less obviously tea production not being as much of a part of what was going on in Central and South America. And so the economic impact of coffee is pretty substantial. If you pull it out, you definitely have some different courses of history. Perhaps you don't have as much success by the Portuguese because for what period of time both the Portuguese and the Dutch held something of a monopoly on the coffee trade, and that was a very powerful thing of what was there. The French then come to that with some of their possessions in South and Central America as well over time. And so coffee removed changes the flow of economic history. Tough to get real precise about what that would be because other things were still being traded and other commodities would have probably become more prolific. But coffee was a major mover and shaker. So if you change that, you change what's moving and what's shaking during that period of time. But I think by far probably the most impactful element of coffee on history actually is the rise of what it does in social culture and thus leads to in terms of enlightenment and thought. And because of the nature of how coffee is consumed, almost from very early on, this is true in Turkish coffee houses and some of the ways that coffee is consumed in Yemen and in parts of Africa and in the modern Middle East, is that it led to situations where coffee was consumed in a social setting. A coffee house or a particular place where coffee was prepared and produced. And thus, as a result of that, the consumption of coffee became a social event. While most of us also drink our coffee alone today, very often, we talk about those that we encounter in the break room, the interactions that we have in our workplace. Those are around going and getting what? A cup of coffee. When we think about the number of people that meet, the amount of business today, for example, that occurs over business discussions and business meetings, or people that de facto use Starbucks and the access to internet Wi-Fi there as their de facto offices. Again, this is the impact of having a place where coffee is culturally consumed very often in a meeting place where people gather to do so. This is true less so in the modern sense for tea or other beverages. I guess another beverage that would fit that way would be the bars or taverns, and we certainly know that they had an influence around the consumption of alcohol in a similar way. But coffee becomes the place where people meet in coffee houses to relate socially, but then that very easily translates into the relation of business. And so, for example, in one of our previous episodes, we talked about the growth of the insurance business, and we talked about the importance of an organization like Lloyd's of London in terms of rising to be one of the largest insurers and the influence that they had on insurance culture. As we talked about in that episode, Lloyd's was a coffee house. And so it was a place that people gathered together, businessmen, merchants, others gathered together to share coffee. But what rose out of that was actually the place where underwriting for various merchant voyages happened there. And so Lloyd's becomes an insurance company growing out of a coffee house. And so there's that economic impact now tying back to the social aspect of the coffee house. The other thing that can certainly be said, and this is true all the way through until modern times, I mentioned modern Starbucks, but think of coffee houses in the culture in the 1960s in the United States in terms of the counterculture that was going on there, going back to the French Revolution, going back to periods of time in Germany before it became a modern nation state. Artisans, thinkers, students, it was very common for them to meet together and to interact in the confines of the coffee house. And so the coffee house became what some people in history actually began to refer to as penny universities. The cost of a cup of coffee was relatively inexpensive, and you could go there and interact with other people, have discussions, have debates. And so it was a place where much of what we know as modern political philosophy and political thought to a great degree arose out of one place, the coffee house. And it's interesting to me in the sense that that's something that precedes moving over time, is how that plays itself out as we move forward. And so the importance of coffee, probably in its biggest sense, if it didn't exist, is, while certainly revolution, rose in the taverns and beer halls and other places where alcohol was consumed in the bars. No doubt about that. There's great historical history for that. We would be missing the element of whatever the coffee house or its substitute would have been on culture, and thus on our politics and our evolution of thought. And so that's a really important thing to understand, that coffee played a major role in the development of what we might think of today as being modern thought, the Enlightenment, um, democracy, other things like that directly flow out of the existence of the coffee house and what it meant. It's also interesting to note that while coffee was generally thought of as being an acceptable social drink, for example, it was more acceptable to be found in the coffee house than it was necessarily to be found in the tavern or the bar, particularly during the day. And so that led to being a safe place that people could go and have interchange and have exchanges of thought in a public environment on a regular basis. And this one, finally bringing it all back around to a conclusion, it's interesting to think about the fact that it actually comes back full circle in terms of coffee having an influence again on the economy. Uh, Before the rise of the Industrial Revolution, with most of the things that people were doing in terms of work being agrarian in nature, that flowed with the natural rhythms of the seasons and daylight and dark. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of factories and regimented work schedules that went by the clock and very often exceeded what would be normal in terms of what would be the natural rhythms here, coffee becomes an important part of that in the sense that it became one of the stimulants and the driving factors that enabled folks to be a little bit more awake and aware when they were now working in a factory, working in hours that weren't necessarily matching up with what they were most accustomed to in terms of being able to be effective. And so you sort of have this thing come full circle. Coffee originally sort of in the social setting that I just described being the place where intellectuals would meet or students would meet or those that had leisure time in urban areas that were able to gather together versus those that lived out on the farm or in rural areas are able to gather together, is that coffee then becomes almost the drink of the masses. And that's certainly something that we see in the rise really post the American Revolution, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere in the 19th century with the importance of coffee in the workplace. So much so that what is even allowed in the workplace, the one time you might actually be able to do where you're not working on the production line, is you're actually able to have a coffee break, showing how much coffee had interwoven itself into the work culture, the social culture that was attached to that. So just thinking back on it, coffee is important. Whatever those Ethiopian goats may have led us on to in the 9th century has led down to something that has had an impact in all the centuries from then until now, but certainly continues to have an impact today in terms of its influence across the board. So it's a world without coffee would be a different world than it is today. Probably the last thing I just want to mention here is there's a concern about the future where we actually could see a world without coffee. One of the things that I've read here and have noticed in some of our research and getting ready for this episode is there's a lot of concern about the nature of what climate change may do and the shifts in climatology potentially over the next 50 to 100 years about where coffee can be cultivated. And as a result, while there a lot of demand for it today, and there still are in some cases supply restraints and differences in terms of balancing supply and demand that do exist today, this should become even more prevalent moving forward, as there may be less of the areas that are in the right spot, the Goldilocks zone on the map to be able to cultivate coffee that are available. And as a result of that, we might see coffee become a much more valuable commodity, a much scarcer commodity, or we might see something else rising in its place just by the sheer nature of needing something else to rise in its place, just because it's not as readily available as it used to be. So I don't know if that means buying Starbucks stock is a good idea or not, or for example, Folgers or any of the others that I might mention that would be widely known as being coffee-related companies or coffee-related industries now. But certainly there's the chance moving forward that we might move towards a world where coffee is scarcer, harder to come by, or the means by which it's produced and where it's produced might change, which would have economic impact, particularly on those nations where it's a major part of their agrarian exports today. I mentioned Brazil being one example, but certainly they're not the only nation in South America that has an economy that relies heavily upon the production and export of coffee. So, thanks for joining us today here on A Fork in Time. We appreciate you giving us a few minutes of your time. We are working to get back on to be honest with you, a more consistent basis with our weekly release. So, I'll give you a little bit of an apology here. Real life gets in the way of this thing called a podcast from time to time, and so we're working on getting back in the regular rhythm of doing so. While we've even also, of course, tried to launch the companion podcast, The Room Where It Happened. If you haven't listened to that, we would invite you to do so. All of this can be found via our website at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. We'd invite you to go there. That's a place to provide us feedback, have some different thoughts on this episode, let us know. But also a place to give us topic suggestions, also a place to interact with us as we work on building our alternate history community here. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, there's links there to our various social media, so we would encourage you to go there. And of course, a link to our Patreon page, where if you are able to do so and are so inclined to do so, you can provide some financial support to the podcast. Finally, I'd just also like to mention that we do have merchandise. I actually drinking during a couple of breaks while I was doing the recording here, drinking some coffee out of what? My A Fork in Time coffee mugs. So if you want to associate this particular episode with maybe getting some A Fork in Time swag, you can also find out how to do that on the website as well. Most of all, we want to thank you again for your attention, for your willingness to participate in what we do here, for being a listener, and giving us the most valuable gift that you can give us, which is your time. Hope that you join us next time, and if between now and then you encounter A Fork in Time, our suggestion always is that you take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.